like to welcome you all. Thank you all for your willingness to participate in this. Each month we try to do it on a different topic having to do with international humanitarian law. And this month, I am so lucky because I have Larry Dietz, who is one of our expert IHL instructors in our region, who has an amazing background in the military. And we also have Richard, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Lennane. Oh, I did it right. I'm so excited.
Let's
Richard
go. Let's
Lennane,
go. Well done.
who is from Geneva, and he's actually, it's late at night where he is, and he is going to speak on the military and IHL and I imagine military disarmament. And Larry is going to sort of fill in the gaps between what's happening now and the challenges with international humanitarian law. But Richard has had an amazing background of having traveled and worked in foreign countries, and he'll probably give you a little bit of an example of that when I invite him to speak. But he also has done some amazing policy papers and research on military disarmament. And I was most drawn to one of the papers he did, and I told him so. And he can put that in the chat if he wants to, or we can send it out next week along with our follow-up email, where we'll send you out more information about and resources about IHL. So Larry, I didn't announce you fully, but I will when we do the introductions, if that's okay with you, or would you rather introduce yourself before we start?
Jill, I'm just grateful that you let me say anything when you're on the air.
Are you kidding? Oh, so we have a recording now. Is that correct, Ariti?
Yeah, that's correct.
Aditi, thank you so much. Okay, so basically, Richard, I'm going to ask you, I warned you, I'm going to ask you this cuckoo question. When you were in high school or secondary school, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
Well, that's an easy one, Jill. I had no idea. Adulthood looked to me like a mysterious and baffling thing, and lots of my friends knew what they wanted to do, but I never had a clue, and I still don't know, to be honest.
So what was your very first thing that you did when you graduated from high school or college?
What I did was I took what the young people today call a gap year, in fact 2 gap years, and I went to work because the language I'd studied at high school was Japanese, and I got a job showing educational films at the Japanese consulate in Sydney, in Australia, where I grew up. And I worked there for a year, saving my pennies. And then the second year, I went off traveling, and I went to Japan. And then I went across what was then still just the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Europe and to Geneva, where I live now. But at that time, I had no idea I would end up living here. And I bummed around Europe as youngsters do, and then came back to Australia, went to university, found out that the degree I wanted to do wasn't possible for scheduling reasons, and so sort of stumbled into something else, and from there stumbled into a job at the Foreign Ministry in Canberra. And then I've just been stumbling from one thing to another ever since. And here I am talking to you all today.
So you think that your travel helped you get your first job that was international?
Certainly. I mean, it certainly got me interested in foreign affairs and international relations and things like that. But I really applied for that job with the Foreign Service on a whim, with a bunch of other applications, as you do when you're finishing college, and somehow got this job, and I had no idea what it was about, and still don't. And yeah, I found myself being a diplomat, and then because I studied Japanese, and that was my language. When I got into the foreign ministry, of course, they put me in the Middle East division. And then I ended up going on postings to Egypt and then Syria, where I, of course, used not a word of Japanese. And then coming back from the Middle East, I was placed, returning to Canberra to the ministry there. I was put more or less at random. I'm sure it's the same in the State Department. You come back from a posting and they just stick you where they've got a gap. And they put me in the arms control and disarmament department and set me to work on negotiating a protocol to the Biological Weapons Convention, which I knew nothing about. This was totally, I'd never studied anything to do with disarmament or security or these kinds of things, let alone biology. And but I just got totally hooked on it, and it's become my career. But as I say, I just kind of stumbled into it. I had no plans. If you'd asked me when I was 16 or 17, would I be a multilateral disarmament negotiator or something like that, I said, what the hell is that? I have no idea what you're talking about.
Totally understand. And the ICRC, what brought you to the ICRC, and what has been probably one of the most meaningful experiences of being in the ICRC? What was there any event or experience that stands out for you?
I'm only fairly recently in the ICRC. I'm just starting my third year, and it's kind of the end of a journey around a whole lot of different kinds of institutions that work in this field. I mean, ICRC's only sort of perhaps peripherally or partly involved in disarmament. So I started as a national government delegate going to talk about disarmament treaties and so on with other governments. Then I worked for the United Nations, so kind of running the meetings that I used to participate in as a national delegate. And that was interesting in a different sort of way. It's more sort of chess game where you've got pieces to move around and you work with all kinds of different countries, different delegations, and see what you can get them to do together. Then I had a kind of epiphany, conversion, religious conversion. I mean, not religious, but I threw it all away and left the UN and quit to start my own NGO to lobby for a new treaty, which was the treaty that's now called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But when I started, it had no name because it didn't exist. And that, I think, really brought me into regular contact with the ICRC, because the ICRC was also working on trying to prohibit nuclear weapons, which is something the ICRC has done since 1945. And I think, and after that, I worked for some other NGOs and other organizations, and then came into the ICRC. But you asked what the most sort of important moment was, or what was most meaningful or affected me. I think it was really, the involvement of the ICRC in trying to eliminate nuclear weapons, because that was based so very strongly on actual personal experience of ICRC and Japanese Red Cross staff who'd been among the first to be on the scene in Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was detonated there 80 years ago. And to read like some of the internal reports, the telegrams that were sent back then about what it was like and what had happened and what the effects were, and just to see then this is not just some policy or something that's dreamed up in conference rooms. This is a mission that the ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement has taken on, like so much of what it does with IHL, informed by actual experience of what the horror of war means and what something as horrible as a nuclear weapon means when it is actually used. So that's what I think brought me into the ICRC, and that's why what I find particularly meaningful about the organization, that it's a kind of humanitarian mission, and it's an idealistic mission in a way, but it's based very strongly, as I'm sure you know, Jill, and you've already said, based
Yes.
on direct experience of what the reality of war and what it means.
And what would you like to educate people today about?
What I want to talk to you today about. And thank you very much all for joining. It's wonderful to see people from so many different parts of the United States. I really didn't know that there'd be such broad attendance. It's great to meet you all. Thank you all who introduced yourselves earlier on. I'd like to talk to you about disarmament and its relation to international humanitarian law, and how disarmament supports IHL, and how it's really kind of intertwined with what we're trying to do with the mission of the ICRC and the movement, and how disarmament contributes in a very practical way to upholding and making IHL work in practice. So shall I carry on, or do you want to have Larry introduce?
Yeah,
no. Well,
please go. This is your carry on time.
I'll carry on, thanks. And please, everyone, do, of course, we'll have questions at the end and so on, but if you want to interrupt at any point or ask something in the chat, please do go ahead. So I'm going to talk about the connection between disarmament and IHL, and after I've done that, Larry's going to come and he's going to talk about some of the things that are coming up on the horizon, the new technologies and new kinds of weapons, and how the challenges that they pose for IHL, and how this sort of disarmament approach could maybe work for those, and some of the obstacles that we might face in trying to deal with it. So to start off, I mean, what is the connection? When we talk about disarmament in general, it's often thought of as a kind of something that's about security and defense and sort of relations between potential warring parties or rivals. So if it's a disarmament between the First and Second World War, for example, when there are limits on the number of battleships you can make and these kinds of things, which of course, as we know, didn't work very well. And after the Second World War, there was also a big part of the motivation for founding the United Nations was to really try and get rid of a lot of these weapons. There was this concept of general and complete disarmament, which kind of sounds a bit idealistic and naive today. But if you look back at some of the early resolutions of the United Nations and some of the early reports and so on, they're really very serious about it, that this was an important ingredient in our efforts to avoid another sort of global war, and that reducing the number of weapons and the types of weapons, that was part of what we had to do. So that's one part of it. And the way of looking at that also is that it's kind of we make agreements between countries who say, okay, you get rid of this number of missiles and we'll get rid of this number of fighter jets, and you can have so many tanks and we'll have that many tanks. And you saw it with nuclear weapons, for example, between the United States and the Soviet Union back in the Cold War, when you had the strategic arms limitation talks and the strategic arms reduction treaty. And this is all kind of also driven by economics, I think, because you can save a lot of money if you don't have to build quite so many missiles and bombs and bombers and warships and so on. So that's one kind of disarmament. That's important, and that can contribute to global security and peace. Doesn't always work, of course. But there's another kind, and this is the kind that's more connected to IHL, and it's what we now call humanitarian disarmament. And it's the idea that, in line with the goals of international humanitarian law, is to kind of mitigate the horrors, the impact of war, knowing that war is going to take place. So how can disarmament contribute to that? And there's two ways. You can reduce the impact of weapons. So to put this very simply, if you don't have a certain type of weapon at all, then you can't misuse it. You can't use it disproportionately. You can't use it indiscriminately. You can't use it at all. So if you can eliminate certain kinds of weapons, take them away from the battlefields, don't have people tempted to use them or misuse them, then that's already an important contribution to improving compliance with IHL. So to give an example, a very successful example is the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, sometimes called the Ottawa Treaty. And this was done in 1997. in response to very long-standing concerns about the humanitarian impact of anti-personnel landmines, that they're indiscriminate, that they can't distinguish between soldiers and civilians, or adults and children, and even worse, they hang around long after the battle is over, long after the war is finished. For years and decades afterwards, they stay there in the ground, waiting for someone to step on them. And it means that farming land can't be used. It means that roads are closed. Kids can't get to school. You can't go and get water. And there's terrible injuries. People's lives and livelihoods are wrecked for long after the conflict has ended. So that's a weapon that has a huge humanitarian impact, far out of proportion to its military utility, its usefulness as a weapon of war. But looked at purely from an IHL point of view, you can say, well, you can use an anti-personnel landmine legally. You can use it. You can be very careful where you put it. You can mark the location. You can fence it off and put warning signs, a warning minefield. You can keep maps. You can keep track of where you've put the landmines, and then you can be conscientious about clearing them after the war is over. But what ICRC found, and many others found, that in practice, that this is never done. Well, not never, but rarely done. And the way that anti-personnel landmines are used in practice is that carelessly they're used in the heat of battle. You've put them where you need them. You forget where they are. They get moved around by the weather or by enemy troops or whatever, and they end up all over the place. It's very expensive and very time-consuming and dangerous to clear them, and they have this huge impact. So the result of this kind of information and study and determination that these weapons are just not worth it, because often they end up killing your own soldiers anyway. It's really better to just get rid of them altogether. And so this treaty was negotiated. I mean, if we had longer, I could tell you the whole quite interesting story. But the point is that the treaty was done, and it was done without the participation of a lot of the bigger military powers, including the United States and Russia and China and India. They didn't agree on this. They didn't want this treaty. They wanted to continue using anti-personnel landmines. And there was this question like, well, what is the point of having a treaty that bans a particular weapon if the countries that have the most of these, the countries that are the biggest producers and users of this weapon, they're not in the treaty, and they reject the whole idea. And this is really perhaps the fundamental difference between the first kind of disarmament that I talked about, this kind of military-to-military security-based disarmament, and humanitarian disarmament, because humanitarian disarmament is about not who has the weapon, it's about who's affected by the weapon. So it's a treaty not between the countries possessing landmines, it's a treaty among the countries that are affected or potentially affected by the humanitarian impact of landmines. And that just kind of transforms the whole thing politically, because it gives agency and power to those countries that are affected by the problem. It doesn't matter if they're the big military powers, it doesn't matter if they're big countries or small countries. Their role in this treaty and the way it works is that they have this problem, they want to get rid of anti-personnel landmines, and because they are affected by it, it's their people who are being injured and killed, it's their economies that are being damaged, it's their agriculture that's being inhibited. So they have they're the sort of main players in this effort. But there was a lot of skepticism. I mean, it's a silly idea. You do this treaty without the United States, without China, without India, without Russia. I mean, what's the point? But it proved really quite quickly that it works very well. So this treaty went ahead. It had now today it has around 160 member states. And it's been hugely successful in actually making a practical difference, because since it's come into force, there's been something like 60 million anti-personnel landmines destroyed. and hundreds of square kilometers of land cleared and returned to constructive use, productive use. And if the landmines don't exist, you can't use them. And this is again different to treaties that might have rules about, and also IHL in general, rules about how you use certain weapons. So, for example, there's a treaty called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that also has rules and regulations about anti-personnel landmines, but they're restrictions. They're not a prohibition. So you can keep your landmines and you promise to use them carefully and do the right thing. But of course, sometimes people do and sometimes they don't. Whereas if the landmines are totally eliminated, you can't use them. You won't be tempted. There's no risk. They're gone. And this is just so much more effective. And as well as so we've seen, like with the destruction of the stockpiles, the clearness of the land, and landmine casualties, sort of, in the first 20 years of operation of the treaty, went down from a huge amount, from I think around 15,000 a year down to less than 3,000. So it really made a very big difference practically. But the other interesting thing that happened, and this brings me to the second way that these treaties work. So one is the physical destruction or removal of the weapons. So you can't misuse them. You can't use them to violate IHL. But the other side is the normative effect, where the existence of the treaty and the fact that this law exists and it's being operated and implemented and a number of countries are doing it, that over time tends to influence, it builds a norm and it influences the behavior even of countries that haven't joined the treaty. So what we saw with the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention is that although, as I mentioned, these big countries didn't join and still haven't joined, over time they started to change their behavior to influenced by the effect of this treaty. So we saw, for example, that international trade in anti-personnel landmines dropped right down to pretty much zero. Manufacturing also stopped, even among the countries that still used landmines. They stopped producing them largely, including the United States. And this idea that an anti-personnel landmine is a bad thing, that it's something you try to avoid using, even if you still possess them, really took hold. So more and more countries saying things like, "Oh, well, we're not joining the convention, but we don't use anti-personnel landmines, or we don't use them here." And even to the extent that the United States, which had been one of the strident critics of the treaty, came to the point, unfortunately it's gone backwards now, but during the Obama administration, the United States announced that it would abide by all the provisions of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, except in the Korean Peninsula. So, this was quite an achievement that this treaty had built such a norm and such a sort of standard of behavior and a perception of these weapons, that even countries that for military reasons or security reasons felt that they couldn't join really started to follow the rules in a sense. So that's quite impressive. To give you another example, it's also very much what we've seen in other kinds of weapons, chemical and biological weapons. You may have heard of the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which was really a sort of watershed moment in IHL and in disarmament law, because that came after the First World War and all the horrific effects of gas, poison gas, chemical weapons in the trenches of the First World War in Europe. And that was the first attempt to really seriously restrict or prohibit those kinds of weapons. But at first it was just a prohibition on use. There was no prohibition of developing or possessing chemical and biological weapons. And it was only later on in 1972 that we had the Biological Weapons Convention, which totally prohibited the development, production, possession, acquisition, transfer of biological weapons. But this is also a very interesting treaty because it's very simple. It's only 4 pages long if you want to look it up. It doesn't take long to read. It has very broad prohibitions. It's like the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not use germs to kill people. but it doesn't have any kind of verification. It doesn't have any way of inspecting or checking countries to check that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And it was widely criticized for this. And indeed, there have been allegations of non-compliance. Some of them were later shown to be true. And this has dogged the treaty ever since it came into force in 1975. But the interesting thing about it is that despite this, in a way, it's kind of ineffectual. There's no enforcement. There's no verification. There's nothing. If someone violates it, well, what can you do? And yet, it's really transformed the kind of normative landscape, if you like, because now, although membership's not quite universal, I think it is 180 something states parties, but even the countries that haven't joined, nobody would now say, oh no, the biological weapon is okay. We reserve the right to, for the sake of our national security, we reserve the right to possess and use biological weapons. This is war. We need to take every necessary measure for our security. Nobody says that. Nobody would say that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't clandestine biological weapons programs out there, secret somewhere. Maybe there are. But the very fact that they're secret, that already tells you something important. People keep them secret because they know they'd be in trouble if they were caught. And this is a huge transformation when you look back to, say, the 1950s and 1960s, when biological weapons were kept by the superpowers, by other states, UK, Germany, others. We have our nuclear weapons, we have our biological weapons, we've got to be prepared, that's what you do. No kind of apology or regret about it. It's just part of the arsenal. That's completely changed. Because of this treaty, which 4 pages long of sort of general precepts, has really transformed the normative environment. And we could talk a lot more about how exactly that happened and why. But I just wanted to give you that example. And another one I also like to point out is kind of the sister treaty to the Biological Weapons Convention is the Chemical Weapons Convention. This came along a bit later in the 1990s, and it's a much more sophisticated treaty. It has provisions for verification, for inspections, for what they call challenged inspections. There's an international organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And it has laboratories, it has trained inspectors with spacesuit protective gear and stuff, and they can go out at short notice and inspect chemical factories or inspect the site where someone has alleged that chemical weapons are being used. It's a very serious operation, and again, that's very good. But there's always questions. Well, are people complying with it? Are they? Why should we follow this treaty if the bad guys don't, and this kind of question. And during the Syrian civil war, as I'm sure you know, there were allegations of use of chemical weapons, and people were saying, well, this is a big worry. This shows that the Chemical Weapons Convention is being undermined. It's people not respecting it. It's losing the norm is collapsing. But if you look at what happened in Syria, and the kind of reactions, I find it very interesting because there were accusations that Assad, excuse me, the Assad government forces had used chemical weapons. They denied this. And if you look at the whole sort of story of allegation and counter-allegation and the various investigations, the whole controversy was conducted entirely within the bounds of this norm, that chemical weapons are bad. Nobody said, it would have been quite easy because at the beginning of the conflict, Syria was not actually a member of the Chemical Weapons Convention. They could have said, well, yeah, we use chemical weapons, sure. It's a war. We're under threat. We have to use whatever military means we can to prevail. But they didn't say that. Every allegation was, it wasn't us. It was the other guy, or it wasn't chemical weapons. It's a mistake. It never happened. And okay, they're lying, but the fact that they feel they have to lie and they have to deny it, this is already, I think, quite powerful evidence of how wide this norm is spread and how strong it is. Like, they don't just say, yeah, sure, we use chemical weapons. They say, no, it wasn't us. You can't prove it. We didn't do anything. Which, I take as quite an encouraging sign. Of course, it would be better if they didn't use chemical weapons, and the mechanisms we can use to sort of bring people to justice and investigate properly are still quite limited. But still, it's from the point of view of IHL and sort of discouraging militaries and governments from using weapons that have these terrible humanitarian effects. It's really been quite effective. So I think that's a good result. I'm gonna stop soon. I just want to Jill asked me to sort of inject some of my personal history or story into this talk. So just to kind of try and illustrate a bit more about the sort of underlying ideas behind this form of disarmament. I'm going to tell you about my sort of religious conversion and how I got out of the UN and into this effort to create the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Because I'd worked previously on the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. I knew about this humanitarian approach and this idea that it's the countries that are affected by the weapon that are the actors that count, and they're the ones who drive the treaty. And I was working in the Office for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. I was working on the Biological Weapons Convention. And I'd heard, so nuclear weapons wasn't my day job, but I'd kind of kept abreast of what was going on. And I'd heard people were pushing this idea of, well, why don't we take this approach of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, and there'd been a subsequent one, which is the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which is very much the same approach a few years later. And so why don't we use that and try and do something about nuclear weapons? I'd heard this kind of rumors, and I thought, I mean, nuclear weapons are different, right? I mean, these are big strategic assets. These are how the big players protect themselves, exert their power, protect their interests. This is not like little landmines that you sprinkle over the ground. I mean, you don't really need those, but nuclear weapons, they're serious. This humanitarian thing it's not going to work. And I didn't think much more about it until this process got going a bit, and the people behind it organized a conference in Oslo in 2013. And this was a conference on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. It wasn't a political move. It wasn't sort of trying to do a new treaty or to do anything. It was just to sort of examine and study and talk about what are the actual consequences of nuclear war, what would happen if these weapons were used again, and so on. And as a first step of trying to push this nuclear weapons issue into this humanitarian space. And I sort of noted this in passing, but then something very interesting happened. Two things happened at the same time. One was that the states, the countries with nuclear weapons, the US, China, Russia, UK, France, so-called P5, along with India and Pakistan and North Korea and Israel, they all reacted very strangely to this Oslo conference. It was almost panic that they saw something moving they didn't like, and there's more the P5 than the other ones. And they really took a set against it. They tried to stop it. They tried to discourage people from going, which struck me as very strange. I mean, what's the big deal? You can go to Oslo and you can say, oh yes, we're gravely concerned. This is why we need your support to work through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and help us take the responsible course. But they didn't. They kind of freaked out, which struck me as odd, because the main reason to sort of reject this humanitarian approach to nuclear disarmament was to say, well, why would they care? You can make a treaty about nuclear weapons, but if it doesn't include the countries that have the nuclear weapons, again, like the landmines, what's the point? It's not even like landmines. You're not going to be clearing landmines and helping victims and so on. so what's the point? But why would they care? But clearly they did care, and this really struck me. And the other thing that happened was a colleague of mine, we were discussing humanitarian disarmament because we were writing a paper about it. And we were talking about the fact that, it's the countries that are affected by the weapons that are the ones concerned, and this is what drives the process. And my colleague said, yeah, actually, you wouldn't need any of the countries that have the weapons to be in the treaty. And this kind of struck me like a bolt of lightning. I went, oh yeah, you don't need any of them. And I kind of put two and two together and thought, well, the nuclear weapon states, they seem to be really worried about this. And actually, you could have a treaty without any of them in it, and maybe that's what they're worried about. And I got very excited, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is like the first crack in the armor of like 50, 60 years of talking about nuclear disarmament. Finally, there's an opening. And I waited to see like what all the campaigners, the civil society, the NGOs, and the countries without nuclear weapons are always unhappy, to see what they did about it. And nothing happened. And this started to really get on my wick. I mean, I couldn't, why can't they see this? Why can't they see this? And eventually, to cut a very long story short, I got so frustrated and so kind of frantic, like this opportunity is passing us by. We have to get out and do something. That eventually I quit my job, went off, got some funding, set up a new organization, specifically and only to pursue this idea of making a treaty that would outlaw nuclear weapons that didn't include any of the countries that actually had nuclear weapons, and it would be based purely on the humanitarian approach. That was the start of a very strange journey for me, and it was very controversial at the time. It's still controversial. I burned a lot of professional bridges, kind of like going out from a respectable United Nations job into this sort of ragbag collection of NGOs and peaceniks and campaigners. But it was absolutely worth it. And it kind of really did transform the way that we think about nuclear weapons. It's still early days. I mean, the treaty is entered into force in 2021. Will it work? Will it not? What difference will it make in the end? Who knows? Developments in the last couple of years are really not very promising. But let's see. So I'll stop there. I've talked for a long time. Sorry, Jill. And but of course, I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards. But I better leave a bit of time a lot of time, I hope, for Larry to talk about the future. Back to you, Jill.
Richard, one of the things that I'd like to talk about in the Q&A is whether IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are actually a different kind of anti-personnel mine and should actually be covered by those treaties. I think that might be interesting.
We can certainly get to that.
Where did our hostess go?
Yes,
she's missing in action.
I can start sharing screen, and we can wait for Jill to come back, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead, Larry?
Okay. Let me just give a little pertinent background before I start. I'm not a disarmament guy like Richard. My background is a combination of high tech. I'm a recovering market research analyst. I covered the market for cybersecurity products for a long time. I'm an attorney. I'm a member of the bar of the great state of California, the District of Columbia, and the United States Supreme Court. Retired from the United States Army Reserve as a colonel, background similar to Milt Himes, only I started in the intelligence business. I was a SIGINT platoon leader in Vietnam as a young second lieutenant, knowing nothing. And in 1997, I arrived in Sarajevo, Bosnia on my 51st birthday as the deputy commander of the NATO PSYOP campaign. So I have a background like that. I've been a Red Cross volunteer since 1999. My principal role is volunteer partner to the regional marketing director, but I'm also a expert IHL instructor. I'm an SAF volunteer. I end up doing briefings along with my beloved wife, Liz Dietz. And I was recently given the gap of elected official liaison, in addition to my other sins. So, I also teach online for 3 colleges. I teach national security subjects for American Military University at the undergraduate level. I teach national security subjects at the graduate level for the Institute of World Politics, and I'm on the adjunct faculty of Monterey College of Law, where I teach negotiation skills for law students. It's a prereq. You have to pass the course. I've been teaching with a colleague for 6 years. Unfortunately, she's decided to retire and become a grandma. I can't see the advantage in that, never having been a grandma. But my background is a little different. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the future. By way of full disclosure, I had help with this project from my new best friend, my new girlfriend, Gemini. If any of you are familiar with Gemini, I find her always ready to listen. She's very entertaining. She's kind of smart, and she knows a lot of stuff. And Gemini, of course, is Google's AI. So let's jump right in it. My goal is to just give you some background information on a little bit forward as opposed to backward. Richard has also focused a lot on nation states as signatories of treaties, and has also mentioned that it is difficult to enforce IHL, even with traditional weapons where you know what they are. So let's go into the next slide. So I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that everybody here knows how to read slides. So I'm not going to read the slides. But I like to use slides because they linger on after the presentation, and they show that the speakers have done their homework a little bit. And it can be a useful checklist for the speaker as to what to cover. On this one, I think it's important to note the common sense things that everybody should know. The new technology has dual use. And when you study international law and you look at proportionality and you look at some of the other principles, the dual use application, is it a good target? The dual use application is one of the most difficult analyses to do. And dual use, for those of you who are not versed in IHL, means that the technology in question can be used for civilian and military purposes. Governance, meaning the law, regulations, always is slower than technology. Technology is always faster. Also, international humanitarian law, and disarmament in particular, requires an international cooperation. It requires, for the most part, voluntary compliance. There is no sheriff that's going to ride into town on the proverbial white horse and make everybody do the right thing. That just doesn't exist. And unfortunately, we live in a world that's, for lack of a better description, a victim of international partisanship. So those are some of the background challenges. Let's just go to the next slide here. Okay, cyberspace. One of the things that cyberspace is, of course, is it has no borders. Cyberspace also has leveled the playing field in the sense of the ability to execute a cyberspace operation, and attack, if you will, is pretty low. I mean, you don't have to be a very high-powered technical person. You can go out on the internet, learn how to be a hacker, and you too can end up fighting on the cyber battlefield. My concerns are in terms of non-state actors, people that don't play by the rules in particular, and of the growing influence of transnational criminal organizations as using cyber as a tool. And these criminals also get to fund terrorists. And while I don't know for sure, I'm guessing can fund proxies. Proxies are organizations that are non-state actors that are supported, if you will, by the state actor. Hamas, and the Houthis are good examples. And it is very difficult to find these guys. In terms of prosecution, let me point out that in the legal business, we have two kinds of jurisdiction, and the court needs both in order to have a trial. The first is subject matter jurisdiction. There was a virus many years ago called the I Love You virus, which was developed in the Philippines. And they caught the perpetrator. The technical term I use in my career as a criminal defense attorney, the dirtbag, lives in the Philippines. Unfortunately, wasn't a crime in the Philippines to write a virus. So there has to be a homogeneity across the international community for subject matter jurisdiction. And the second kind of jurisdiction is personal jurisdiction. I have to be able to get the party into court. When you deal with cyber, this is very difficult. Next slide. AI. I haven't had so much fun with technology since I first learned about the internet with regard to AI. And my girlfriend Gemini and I are spending a significant amount of time together, and we're doing various and sundry things, including prepare for talks, very helpful in editing, very helpful in helping to develop presentations. One of the things that AI purports to do is save money. AI allegedly can reduce people and allegedly make the decision loop faster. By way of historical example, for those of you who remember the 1900 late past century, when computers were first started in business, part of the selling rule was it would eliminate paper. And that turned out to be a real joke, because when people got computers, they ended up printing more stuff than they ever had when they had totally manual systems. I'm going to cover AI a little bit more, but in the era that we're in, particularly in the United States, where the rush to cut money, allegedly saving money, is not given a whole lot of thought, I'm very concerned that AI can be used in the military and other systems, such as operational technology systems. We used to call them SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition, meaning computers that control processes, oil refineries, sewerage, water. If AI is controlling that stuff, it's a great vulnerability for an enemy to attack, notwithstanding the fact that attacking a water system may be contrary to IHL. Next slide. We are just seeing the growth of the Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, the AI that can make its own decisions. And we're seeing this in the commercial sector. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that there are parties at work that are trying very hard to give AI decision-making capability, which would be a terrible mistake. Particularly if we look at, I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but if we look at UAVs, unmanned airborne systems, air systems, better known as drones, you have to have the human in the loop. The military guys say, well, it's nice to have the human in the loop, but they're a lot slower than the enemy. I need to act faster than the enemy. Now, so I need to have that little robot-y thing making them decisions for me. And that would be a total disaster. For those of you that are interested in the dynamics of how a UAV attack works, I highly recommend the Helen Mirren movie. I'm getting a brain fart here now. It's she's a NATO officer, and it's all about UAVs in Afghanistan or Iraq, one of those two things. Excellent movie. Eye in the Sky. That's what it is. Eye in the Sky. The dynamics are very much like that. Next slide. Okay, the human being has to be in the loop. One of the things I do when I teach the Red Cross IHL classes is I use the totally un-Red Cross phrase, good target, bad target. So we have the dual use school bus, one of my favorites. And so scenario number one, we have a bus full of middle schoolers, everybody's favorite age. The hormones are going crazy. They're a child 1 minute, they're an adult the next minute, and they're totally confused and eating the next minute. So some people regard the middle schooler as the enemy, but no, they're not the enemy. So same school bus carrying a bunch of guys with rifles in uniform. Clearly a good military target. Good target. So when you look at the environment of dual use, this complicates the ability for an AI system to be employed, even an agentive AI system that makes its own decisions. So this is a key aspect of it, in my opinion. Let's go to the next one. Richard talked about bioweapons, and I don't know how many of you have ever been exposed to a chemical agent. Milt Times, I know, is on here, and I know he's gone through the same thing. When you're in the service, in the Army, you have the dreaded gas chamber, where you get to test out your protective mask. And the way it works is you're outside, the weather is generally terrible. It's generally hot or raining. It's some kind of awful weather. It's like God is in charge of training. Not only do you have to do training, but you have to be in miserable weather. They just go together. And what you have to do is put your protective mask on. Don't call it a gas mask. Put your protective mask on. And you go into the chamber, which is generally some depressing, ominous concrete cinder block building. And everybody in there is standing around, and you don't see anything. It's just clear as a bell. Nobody's saying anything. And then the moment comes where you have to take your mask off. And so you're exposed to the CS in this ooky building, and it is just not pleasant. So I can tell you that the nature of chemical bio, unpleasant, and like their brothers and sisters in cyber, the skill level, the resource level needed to employ them is going down. So one of the concerns here is that LLMs, I don't know if any of you are, I know some of you Red Cross people like acronyms. LLM is a large language model. That's my girlfriend Gemini, that's Chat GPT. They, in their ability to go through stuff and compute and calculate and analyze, can speed up the design process significantly. So lowering the skill level, lowering the resource level, these are all things that are coming with regard to the bio side. Next. Okay, so even in the traditional world, there are issues with monitoring, control, and I feel obligated to say enforcement. There's the growing technology, which is also getting pretty smart. So today's malicious software, malware, if you will, not only can figure out how to attack the target, accomplish the mission, and then erase itself. I mean, that is very common for today's malicious software. As we see AI develop, as the track of available technology goes on, the smartness of the smartphone, for example, and the crossover between commercial and military. One of the cool acronyms we use in the military is COTS, C-O-T-S, commercial off the shelf. That means I go to Walmart, I buy my DJI drone. I then figure out how to use its camera to go into places where people won't go and collect imagery intelligence. These are things that are definitely evolving in the technology realm. There's also this international partisanship where we have alliances and we have philosophical camps that are aligned and that want to support each other, so that the future of disarmament with regard to these technologies requires a level of multilateral cooperation that we simply don't have today. It also requires responsible innovation by those doing the innovating, those sponsoring the innovating, and those who are able to steal the innovation. And it looks to the affected use theory, perhaps, of treaties. Export controls and transparency. This is particularly difficult in the cyber world. By way of historical example, at one point in time, it was almost impossible to export Microsoft Word because of their encryption capability. And so tomorrow's technology will undoubtedly have much more density of capabilities than we have today. And what else we need? So, summarizing what we need to do in the future, let's go to the last slide. Summarizing on the way forward, we need robust international cooperation. We need ongoing dialogue amongst the parties involved, the innovators, academia, government, military, and so on. We need to try and ensure that the legal framework is evolving to deal with the technology and the practicalities of enforcement. And lastly, notwithstanding the President of the United States, we need to continue research and analysis to understand what's going on. Thank you. That is all I have. Yes, I am.
Larry, I may have missed this, but did you talk about your high school years?
No.
So would you be willing to tell me what you thought you were going to do when you were in high school?
Yes, I wanted to be an attorney because I thought Perry Mason had a really cool job. He had a pretty lady working for him. The other guy got beat up, and he always made Hamilton Berger look like a fool. Looked like a really good job.
And so then what happened in college?
Well, unfortunately, I was a little mama's boy from Brooklyn, and my mother felt I should follow the Jewish boy Oregon Trail and become an engineer. I didn't like engineering, and it didn't like me. So when I got to college, probably the most important thing that happened is the little old lady at the 428th table at Freshman Go To said, "Gym or ROTC?" And I said, "ROTC." I hated gym, every minute and everyone in it. So I went into the Army right after college. My first stop was Fort Gordon, Georgia, Signal Corps training. My second stop was Fort Devens, Massachusetts, electronic warfare, cryptologic officer training. And my third stop was the Republic of Vietnam, where I did everything that kind of NSA kind of does today. My first part of my tour, I was in the signals intelligence business. And the second part of my tour, I was in the cybersecurity business. And that started a foundation of techno competency that I used in my career. In the 70s, I decided I really needed to go to law school. And I had GI Bill money left over. And so I went to law school at night. But unfortunately, I had to work during the day, demanding spouse, dirtbag family. I like the dog. And I couldn't really study for the bar. So I didn't pass the bar until 10 years after I graduated law school. And I've been doing some form of law ever since.
Wow.
As an aside, one of the jobs I don't do very much anymore is I am a volunteer judge in Superior Court in and for the County of Santa Clara in small claims. In the last 10 years, I've probably done 60 or 70 small claims calendars. So
Most
I have,
amazing. I didn't even know this about you.
well, some things we keep close to the shirt.
Oh, is there something that you would really like to impart to this audience today that's really important to you?
Don't believe everything you read on the media. And that while we're talking about things that blow stuff up, information as the domain of war is where it's happening. And unfortunately, I don't think that the U.S. military in particular understands what to do with it. And mealtimes, one day you and I will have to get together for a coffee, and I'll bring you up to date on the PSYOP world, buddy.
Thank you
I'd be
very much.
delighted.
Thank you very, very much, Larry. Anything else you'd like to say before I start asking questions?
That if you're looking to learn about IHL, the go-to is the icrc.org website. They have absolutely the best stuff. They have case studies, they have videos, they have incredibly boring long things, but they are my go-to place for IHL.
Same here. Same here. I would agree. I want to thank you both. This has been most amazing because I took you to secure this route, but I'm so glad that you shared. I have a question in the chat that somebody has that I'm going to read to you. It says, this is probably a really stupid question. There are no stupid questions, by the way.
Oh, yes, there are.
But it's one that I've been thinking about since considering new technologies and so on. If any of you guys are familiar with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics and how much Asimov work goes into those seemingly fundamental laws, circumvented by machines, intentionally or unintentionally, I'm curious about a similar approach would be with an AI, AWS, and other technologies that threaten to remove humans from the loop. Namely, how feasible would it be to take the various legal next steps to talk about compliance with an IHL about rising at least from state level actors. This won't prevent a non-state actor from trying to jailbreak or remove that hard coding, but it might prevent, nor would it prevent a state actor from doing so if they really tried. But would it be sort of considering those rules? And this is by Adam.
Well, I don't know what the robot rules is. It sounds almost like the Sylvester Stallone movie, Judge Dredd, where there are these robots and they know there's a crime going to be committed, so they go out and they kind of blow up stuff. The profession of the law universally has some characteristics, one of which is it's highly protective. And anyone who is an attorney or a judge would be loath to endorse any kind of automated procedures. The fact of the matter is that if you're looking for a model of how might it work, the EU is probably the best model. Why? Because they start with a agreed upon general directive, and each of the member states has to come up with a harmonizing law. Their law can be stricter than the directive, but they cannot be looser than the directive. And so you have to have, I think, a consensus, not necessarily an automated consensus. And I don't know the 3 laws of robotics.
The other thing I was most amazed at is 5 or 6 years ago, pre-COVID, the ICRC was visiting the organizations, the big corporations in Silicon Valley, in San Jose, California, to discuss AI and in the context of international humanitarian law and how to safeguard among those things. So even though it looks like in the newspapers at the ICRC hasn't been doing very much with AI, it's been researching it for the last 7 years, at least 8 years that I know of. And Richard, you might be able to address that more readily than I am. But would you be willing to share that, sharing any information you have about that?
Sure. In fact, this is really what I spend most of my time on the moment. It's autonomous weapons and military applications of AI. And we've just, I'll put the link in the chat in a sec, but we've recently published, well, we've made a submission to the United Nations Secretary General on military, what they call artificial intelligence in the military domain. And that includes 16 what we call preliminary recommendations for AI decision support systems. So these are systems that militaries are increasingly using. You've probably seen the media reporting of some of the systems that the Israeli Defense Force uses in the war in Gaza. For example, to help identify targets or to generate recommendations for military commanders to help them make decisions on the battlefield. There's obviously a lot of concerns about, as Larry's outlined, some of the concerns and challenges with those systems. But if you want to know more about what we're doing on it and what we think should be done, have a look at the submission we made to the UN. I'll just find a link now, and I'll put it in the chat in just a sec.
That sounds wonderful. And maybe, Aditi, you can write down some of the links and in your notes so that we have that. What most of you don't know, or maybe many of you do know who've been here previously, next week we send out a resource list with the books, the movies. Like Eye in the Sky is one of my favorite movies to watch. Books, movies, blogs, even an app that the ICRC has done having to do with IHL that you can put on your phone, and you can look up the 4 Geneva Conventions, the articles and the protocols on. And we'll send that all out next week with any additional resources that either Richard or Larry have for you, along with the recording of this talk. So I wanted you guys to know that we will have that available to you. And thank you, Richard, for putting the article, the artificial intelligence thing in there. It's very helpful. Oop, I just lost. There we go. Anything, any questions that other people have? This is the time to ask your speakers questions that you'd like to have answered before we get off this call. We have about 10-15 minutes before we finish. Is there anything that's a burning question that you have, or a comment you want to make about the talk?
While you're thinking of your questions, I'll just answer what Larry asked before about the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices. They are generally considered, if they are, I mean, the definition of a landmine that's in the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention is it's something that's activated by the victim. So it really doesn't matter if it's made in a factory or it's put together by a bunch of guys in the field from leftover explosives or old artillery shells or whatever. Improvised or manufactured, designed or put together on the spot. If it's activated by someone stepping on it or tripping over it, or if it's triggered by the victim, it's not remote controlled. So a lot of IEDs are detonated by remote control, by someone pulling a trigger or pressing a mobile phone or something. That wouldn't count as a landmine. But if it's activated by something the intended target does or the victim does, then that falls under the treaty and it's prohibited. Of course, the treaty applies to states, to the member states, the states parties to the treaty, not directly to non-state actors and non-state armed groups. But there is a kind of parallel effort that's done by an organization called the Geneva Call, which works with, it's very sensitive work, but they work with non-state armed groups, so armed groups, all sides in a civil war, for example, and they get them to agree to, they have something called a deed of commitment, which gets them to agree to not use anti-personnel landmines. There's various sort of details about that, but that's just what's covered. What the landmine laws say about IEDs, it really depends on how the IED functions.
Thank you so much, Richard. And there's a question by Alex. Alex, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question and show yourself?
I don't know if my camera's going to work. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. So Alexis, I apologize for mispronouncing your name.
That's okay. So I'm a new volunteer and I only recently heard about IHL. I'm here stationed, well, my husband's stationed here in Yokosuka, Japan, and I am taking lead on the IHL for the high schoolers. This is a very general question, so not specifically about anything that we talked about, but maybe just some advice on what both Larry and Mr. Richard would think would be a key thing I could take to the high schoolers to kind of share with them about IHL.
Okay, before they talk, I'm going to share with you something that you might not know about, but we have a program through the International Humanitarian Law called Youth Action Campaign. And this next year, it's going to be journalism and the military. So having that theme, if you look at the ICRC on journalism, you'll find it. But Youth Action Campaign, if you go through your regional director of SAS and IS in Japan, I think Scott Armstrong is there right now, and ask him about the Youth Action Campaign. That's one of the ways that you can get high schoolers involved in how does IHL work. And why, and we do that in Northern California coast. What we've done is we have groups of high schools that compete against each other, and we have a symposium at the end. And they use social media. They bring in speakers to their classes. They do peer support. They ask their teachers if they can do 15-minute presentations on IHL, and they get involved that way. And it's been amazing. We've reached 2,000 or 3,000 people at one time, just using the social media and just by word of mouth, by talking within the classrooms. But Larry and Richard, would you go for it?
My recommendation is you have someone teach the 1 hour Even War Has Rules. It's very painless, highly graphic, very straightforward. It's a really good introduction. It's a great way to understand the basic principles. I find that to be a good first step. By way of example, I've developed a half-a-day workshop, Cyber War and the Law of Armed Conflict. And the first part of it is making sure everybody knows the basics of IHL through that 1 hour course.
I'd just add, there's a lot of, as people have already kindly said, there's a lot of good material on the ICRC website, which the link was shared in the chat earlier. I'll just share something now, which is a video we made on autonomous weapons. It might, I think it's very accessible for kids, and it's kind of, it helps to link sort of some of the ideas of IHL in general as a way to link it to something that's very topical and exciting, if you like, in terms of the new threats appearing.
Another thing you could do is, we did a few years back, we had a 4-minute video contest in the high schools and the colleges. and whoever won got to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with the national head honchos in international humanitarian law. And they also got recognition in their local chapter and by their community. And it was wonderful. We had, I think, 14 or 17 entries for that particular, and each one of them did, why is IHL important? And they started off not knowing anything about IHL. They were doing it sort of for a video class on how to create a video. And they ended up doing this amazing, all of them did amazing work. And so we had first, second, and third honorable mention. So that's another thing that we were able to do. You can also do art contests. You can do interview a family who has been through an armed conflict. It's like there are all sorts of things that you can do, that you can include high school students in, and maybe one of your high school students has been a refugee or has recently come to the United States or come to Japan, from another country, and having them speak in front of a class, or having them create like a virtual or an in-person event. Another thing we do is we do a potluck where everybody brings the food of their family of origin, whatever their background is, whether their parents were born in Europe or their parents were born in South America or Asia or Africa. They bring their food and then they talk about it during the lunch break. You teach an IHL class, and then during the lunch break, or you teach about international services, and during the lunch break, you do that. So those are some of the ideas. Does that help, Alexis? And I'll put my email down also in the chat so that if you have further questions, you can pick my brain, because I truly believe that youth is the future. And if we start really young learning about, I was in international relations. I was in one of the top schools in the nation in my undergraduate work, and I never got taught international humanitarian law. In fact, I learned about it when I went to Geneva as an international delegate to work with refugees. So I think it's so important that we learn it at an early age and that it get taught not only in college, but in high school. That's my end of me proselytizing. I apologize for that. And then there's another comment, I think. Margot, thank you very much for putting it all in there. I appreciate that. That was the essay, art and essay competition that Youth Action Campaign had. It's wonderful. And we'll put all these resources in for you for next week with a follow-up email to all of you who have been registered for this particular class, and for many who had conflicting times that they couldn't come to this particular meeting, so that everybody who registered for the IHL will get a follow-up email, whether you were in this meeting or not. Okay. Anything else? Any last minute questions or comments you want to make to the speakers or to this group?
Yeah, hi, this is David Hamlin. I just wanted to take a moment and thank Richard for all of his efforts in reducing the number of deaths annually due to those landmines. Thank you so much, and all of your teams and team for those efforts. I really appreciate you. Thank you for that.
Thanks, David. That's kind of you to say. It's very important work, and it continues. Unfortunately, we've had some setbacks recently with a number of countries saying that they're going to withdraw from the treaty. But the work to reduce the harm caused by landmines will continue anyway. But thanks for your kind.
I still applaud you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What I was going to say is I got inspired by, I don't know if you know, have you ever heard of Michael Stone, Richard? Michael Stone was the ICRC person. He's head of the alumni, and he worked with Princess Diana, in creating the first education regarding landmine fields. And she became the spokesperson for landmines years and years ago, and I will never forget that. That was, for me, was the beginning, because I had just come back from landmines in the Bosnian War, and I just feel like it's something that a lot of people don't know about unless it gets on the news, and sometimes it's very distorted. And people don't realize that in some countries, landmines exist 9 years, 10 years after a war, and it takes another 9 or 10 years to get the landmines out, because it's very dangerous work to unearth landmines without getting hit yourself or hurt yourself, because there are no maps of that where the landmines are put. So, any other questions? I'm looking in the chat. Anything else that we need to do? Thank you, Larry. There are lots of thank yous, by the way, in the chat. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Larry, and thank you, Richard. I'm so grateful to have met you, Richard. And Larry, I know we're going to have more interactions in the future. It's just the nature of our work. And I think we're going to stop unless anybody has any other questions. And Richard just put his email in the chat. I'll put my email in the chat as well. And Larry, you're welcome to do that, so that people, if they need to reach us, can do so. Okay, that's good. I will get a slide that is. But if you could just let me know. There we go. Anything else? That's it. I just want to thank you both, and I want to thank you everybody for showing up at all these different hours. And we'll have speakers next month again. But thank you for being part of this. You are welcome back anytime. Once a month we do this on the third Thursday of every month. So enjoy. That's it.
So thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all. Have
Great
a
to be here.
beautiful